Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Hi, everybody. How you doing today? All right. Thank you for coming out, and thanks to everyone who's online as well for this. I'm really excited today to have Sebastian Dederding here from all the way from Hamburg at the end of his cross-country tour of America, midway through his cross-country American tour. He's been traveling around giving this talk at various places. Sebastian is truly, in my opinion, one of the brightest minds right now, looking at gamification, games for learning in the classroom, from a academically rigorous yet very, very pragmatic standpoint. And the talk we're going to have today is going to be about some of the things that he's discovered by studying classrooms and studying learner patterns and looking at how games can be integrated into a classroom from a design perspective. The format for today, we have an hour and a half. It's going to be about an hour and 15-minute talk, so we're hopefully going to have about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. This is on the live meeting. You should have a video feed, and then I've passed along a PDF of the presentation as well if you want to follow along with that. If you're coming in late and you want a copy, just let me know. I'll send it to you. At the end, we'll also have 15 minutes, and we'll be able to get questions from the folks who are on link as well. So that's all I'm going to say. I'll leave it to Sebastian. So welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks for having me. Thank you so much. Yes, so 9.5 theses on the power and efficacy of gamification. So on the one hand, that's just a very handy way of saying I can ramble on for 60 minutes upon 9 totally unrelated points and still pretend as if I would have some structure. But it's not only that. Of course, 9.5 theses is also a bit a cryptic historical allusion to Martin Luther's 95 thesis on the power and efficacy of indulgences, which he nailed on the door of the Church of Wittenberg back in 1517 and started the Reformation, so basically the split up of the Christian Church. And if your history of Reformation is a bit weak, indulgences were the, quote, remissions of temporal punishments for a sin that has been forgiven. So according to Catholic law at that point in time, even if a sin had been forgiven, and it wasn't a mortal sin, you'd still had to burn for a couple of days, weeks, or years in purgatory before you were allowed to rise up to heaven. And indulgences were basically things that would say, no, you're fine, you don't have to burn in purgatory for that. And the thing that upset Martin Luther so that he has this, right, this very cocky face here, was that these were sold by the Catholic Church as documents in order to finance the renovation of the St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. So essentially, indulgences were the kind of Catholic get-out-of-jail-free card in the game of life, only that jail, in that case, was purgatory. And in a sense, it seems to me that the indulgence, the get-out-of-jail-free card that you can just buy yourself today for all kinds of social and educational and other design problems is this, gamification. This idea that you somehow can use certain elements, certain pieces of games and add them somewhere else in order to make that somewhere else more fun, more engaging, more enjoyable, right? We see it everywhere, as in Khan Academy, which I'm sure every one of you will know, right, where you can earn points and unlock badges for educational activities. We see it all around the sustainability sphere here with Nissan MyLeaf, where your kind of driving behavior is matched up with others to see who drives the most fuel efficiently. Or for life itself, like Mindbloom's The Life game, where you can earn points and badges for having a meaningful conversation with your kids, because why else would you? So basically, it's really everywhere, right? Microsoft is well on its way as well with Ribbon Hero and other examples. But if you zoom out a bit across all of these kind of different spheres and applications, you find that the defining blueprint for all of this, for I'd say about 90% of what you see out there in the market, is still the early startup Foursquare, where essentially you have an activity you'd like your users to do more often than they're currently doing. In Foursquare's case, check-in. So you give points for that. Basically, you track the user's behavior and you feed it back to the user himself as a kind of form from feedback. Secondly, for a certain set of activities or certain kinds of activities, you add a bit of goal setting and a bit of surprise with badges. Like if you checked in an airport 5 times, then you unlock the jet setter badge. And to spice things up with a bit of competition, you have something like leaderboards or similar where you can compare your scores with friends and colleagues. And if that is not enough, then we add some incentives. Like in Foursquare, a lot of venues, if you become the mayor or check in there, you get a certain special reward, like a free coffee or so. And that's kind of still has been the blueprint of what you see out there in the past 2 to 3 years. So if that's the blueprint, if we see that everywhere, why do I look so angry about this? What are my kind of 95 or 9.5 theses about this? Well, here's the first thesis. Being a good academic, of course I have to say this is nothing new, right? We've seen this in history before. Actually, one of the early fathers of positive psychology, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, already wrote in his classic Flow that the goal of his book, trying to understand what makes an experience optimal, right, what creates a good, a flow experience, was to understand how to turn even routine activities. He was talking about things like mowing the lawn into meaningful games that can provide optimal experience. He was already thinking about this way back in 1990. And of course, in human-computer interaction, as well as in game studies and in games, we have seen a lot of precursors and parallels to that, right? In human-computer interaction, for instance, already in the early beginnings in the 1980s, right, when the field was formed, we had people like Thomas Malone or John Carroll starting to say, we not only have to look at ease of use, but also at fun of use, what makes enjoyable interfaces. And already back then, they were looking at video games to say, okay, what are the design principles here that we can look at and learn from for designing other interfaces? Then obviously with the rise of user experience, right, we have to get away from just utility and usability towards designing experiences. A lot of people became interested in how to design for pleasure or for emotion or for fun. And again, in all of these contexts, people say, games might have something to teach us. Something that came out of this tradition was basically a lot of researchers more recently in human-computer interaction who tried to understand what makes up playfulness, what makes toying around with Ziri or with a Nabat-stack or so a playful experiences. What are the kind of design principles that we can learn and apply in other contexts? One researcher in specific who has looked into that is Bill Gaver, who has coined the term ludic design for kinds of interfaces and applications that, rather than helping us to get things done, invite us to explore and reflect on the experience, like the drift table, which you would move along the floor, and in the little hole in there, you would see how that thing would move along or above a kind of a virtual map, right? Which is not really easy to use, but it invites a very different stance towards the thing that you're looking at. And in human-computer interaction, obviously, we have things like persuasive technology, right, coined by B.J. Fogg as a term. So an interest, how can we use software, digital technology in order to influence people and in order to persuade them? And again, people like here, in this case, Dan Lockton in his Design with Intent toolkit, have looked at video games as a source of design principles in order to persuade people with things like scores or collections or similar. Shifting to video games, we see already in the 1960s people like Clark Siept and the whole kind of simulation in gaming and simulation and learning movement thinking about how you can use video games for serious purposes, most importantly learning outcomes, originally as kind of offline games, but later on, obviously in the early 2000s, then the whole digital serious games movement. In parallel to that, we see things like pervasive games, right, where people have said, can we move games and game elements outside of the traditional kind of, outside of the traditional home setting where you're just sitting there and doing this for entertainment, and can we move this across time, across space, out into the real world? So that's the first thesis. This is nothing new. We have seen a lot of precursors there, and there is actually a lot of thinking and research there that we can already draw upon. This is not a completely new phenomenon. Secondly, again, being a good academic, it's always good to start off with a definition of your terms. So here's a definition I developed with a couple of colleagues of mine. Gamification is the use of game design elements in non-game context. And as with any good definition, every single element of that definition is important. So let's just decompose that and see, what do I mean with that? Game design elements in non-game context. Well, start off with game. What we're basically talking about here is a distinction that the French philosopher and anthropologist Roger Caillois already made back in the late 1950s. He said, if you look across all the kind of different forms of human play that we can see in reality, we basically find that they're organized around these two extreme poles, one of which he called ludus, which you can basically think of most of the traditional video games, board games, card games that you see. That is basically a game that is structured around goals and rules where people strategize and try to min-max their way in order to win it. On the opposite pole of that, you find paideia, or freeform play, as we might find it in improvisational theater or in kids' pretend play, or kids just toying around with toys, right? And what we discovered is when we look at the majority of gamified applications, you find that contrarily to something like the Nabatstuck, they're very much not about toys or play or improvisation involving that, but they're very much on the ludus end of things. They're very much about adding structure, adding rules, adding goals to an experience. So that's the first part of the definition. Gamification is about gaming, it's about these structured things. It's not about playing that much. Secondly, and that is what separates gamification from serious games, most importantly, it's not about designing full systems. It's not about designing full games or full toys, right? It's not the full built Lego set. Rather, it's picking individual elements from video games and applying them somewhere else, right? Rather than a full game, you take something like a leaderboard. And it's not just any which element that gamification takes, because a lot of elements of video games have been appropriated for other purposes, most importantly game technology, right? We use video game engines in order to make machinima, or use video game controllers or game AI for other tasks, or we use game-based practices in the kind of serious gaming movement, right, where people learn to program by developing levels. That is not what gamification does. Gamification specifically takes game design elements of the design of video games, and applies them elsewhere. And elsewhere leads me to my final part of the definition. It is in non-game context. That is basically just us saying, well, this is everywhere. This is not specific to education or any other context, because if you look into kind of the early serious games movement, you find that initially people focused only on learning, and once serious games were expanded and people found, oh, you can use this for sustainability and other purposes, then there was the realization this is not tied to any which specific context. And if you tie these things together, then you basically find how this large prehistory that we find in all of these precursors fall into a nice kind of McKinsey-esque 4-quadrant model, where you have gaming and playing and system and elements as the two axes. So if it's about designing whole systems for gaming, then you're talking about games or serious games. If it's about designing whole systems for playing, then you talk about toys or serious toys. And I think serious toys is a very interesting and underexplored area. If you're talking about design qualities of playing, then you're talking about things like the Nabatstuck playful design. And finally, if you talk about elements or qualities of gaming, then you're talking about gamification. So that was the history and the definition. Now may begin the bashing. My third thesis, gamification is an inadvertent con. That's not my thesis, that's an observation that the video game designer Margaret Robertson already made very early on, very insightfully back in 2009, where she said gamification is an inadvertent con because it tries to trick people into believing that there is a kind of easy add-on way to give something the full motivational and emotional quality of a video game. And as I said, I think her analysis is really spot on, and it is spot on because of basically two big confusions that I find prevalent in the current gamification discourse. The first confusion is a confusion about why video games are fun and engaging, right? If you look across the marketing material and the websites of all of the kind of gamification software platforms you find out there, then you see one word that is repeated over and over again is this here: rewards. Earn rewards, reward your users, give them reward your fans the right way, right? So the underlying mental model here is that Video games are basically a kind of Skinner box where players get rewarded with a little sugar pellet every time they hit the right button at the right point in time. And then what people usually do is that they speak about World of Warcraft and loot drops and variant reinforcement schedules, and then it all somehow makes sense. But if that logic were the case, if the fun in video games came from the reward that you get for a certain activity, then this should be the funnest game ever, earning you a whopping trillion points every time you hit the right button, right? And there are actually a lot of satirical games out there that do exactly this, and you play around with them for a couple of minutes, you find out, yeah, somehow fun for a minute, but not really the fun that I experienced playing World of Warcraft, right? Or if you would translate that to World of Warcraft, that game might look something like this, right? One button, press, drop all loot, that must be the most fun World of Warcraft level ever. Or in terms of Super Mario, because getting the princess, right, that's the final reward of Super Mario, you just hit the button and you get the princess. So if rewards are not the core of what makes video games fun and engaging, then what is it? And to me, the best answer to that question still comes from game designer Rev Koster, who actually wrote a whole book about this. And his thesis is summarized in this one nice pithy statement: fun is just another word for learning. Now, that might sound counterintuitive to begin with, because learning we usually associate with school, and school not necessarily with learning. So what does he mean with that? Let's unpack that a bit. He says, the fun from games comes out of the experience of mastery and achievement. Games are basically machines that put out interesting challenges in front of you that you try to overcome, and that you fail at, and that you have to learn to overcome. And the good experience you get from video games is if you have learned to overcome a challenge that you couldn't master before, right? It's the curve in a racing game that you couldn't take before when you finally make it. It's an NPC that you overcome. It's a puzzle that you solve. It's a chasm that you finally jump. It's the boss monster that you can finally beat. Those are the moments where you experience fun in games, right? Put differently, the fun in games comes out of this tension between you being unsure whether you're actually going to make it or not, and then the happy release when you finally realize, yes, I made it, right? This, I think everybody can say, yeah, that's how video games feel. So the core confusion in the gamification discourse right now, in psychological terms, is that they confuse extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, right? Taking this from self-determination theory, and I'll get a bit on that later, the basic confusion here is that they believe video games, in rewarding people, present you with an extrinsic motivation. That is, there is an activity that is in and of itself not valuable and interesting to you, like sitting still, but in order to do that, you get a reward that sits outside of the activity, right? Like a lollipop. Intrinsic motivation, conversely, is the intrinsic enjoyment, the intrinsic motivation that lies inherent in an activity you like to do for its own sake, like cooking or dancing or playing. And if you look into the psychology of intrinsic motivation for why certain activities are intrinsically motivating, then, as I said, the one theory that you will ultimately end up with is self-determination theory, which is the most robust and empirically well-developed theory of intrinsic motivation right now. And it makes the argument that those activities are intrinsically motivating which satisfy certain innate psychological needs, needs no less innate than physiological needs like hunger or thirst. And the three needs that they have found across cultures and across situations are these three. They are competence, autonomy, and relatedness. And if you match and compare these three with what Rev Koster was talking about, right, the fun of learning, the fun of mastery, then you find that what Koster was talking about is basically this: the experience of being competent, the experience of yourself getting a sense of, yes, I achieved something, I'm good at this, I'm getting better at this. That's the core fun in video games. And Dacey and Ryan have actually done a couple of psychological studies on video games enjoyment, and they found precisely this. They found video games are an excellent source of competence experiences. But the other two, as we will see, are also very important. So that's the first confusion. The fun in playing games chiefly arises from intrinsic enjoyment, not from extrinsic incentives. Let's move on to the second confusion. The second confusion is a kind of cargo cult idea, the idea that you can make something fun just by adding something, just by tagging some game elements onto the existing activity, right? And that's something that we have known and seen over and over again in the tech world, right? If you remember Web 2.0, where everybody tried to build a website that would allow you an architecture of participation where you could harness collective intelligence and everybody would point to Flickr and YouTube, what you usually ended up with was something like this, right? You would get a dropped vowel, you would get rounded corners, and you would get a tag cloud or so. So instead of understanding as O'Reilly called it, the architecture of participation, what were the structural features of sites like Flickr and YouTube that enabled community participation, you got surface features added to that. And that is as well a kind of confusion that you've seen for a long time in the edutainment and serious game sphere, where if you just add cartoony characters and balloons and cartoon sounds, and so then it will make just as much fun as a video game, although in the end, the actual experience itself is just a road test to begin with. So if that's the confusion, and that's the confusion that we see in gamification, what's the opposite to that confusion? And here I think we can take our cue again from Csikszentmihalyi, who spelled it out way back when in Flow in 1990. He said, even these road activities like mowing the lawn can become enjoyable, and here's the important bit, provided one restructures the activity by providing goals, rules, and the other elements of enjoyment. So it is not about adding elements, but it is about looking at a certain system systemically and asking how is this system as a system well structured or poorly structured in order to give rise to experiences of intrinsic enjoyment. So that's the second confusion. Gaminess is not a feature you can add, right? Like usability is not a feature you can add. It's usually about taking features away. It's about the whole structure of the system. So if that's the confusion, the issue here, right? Gamification is an inadvertent con. Is there something we can still salvage? And I think we can, right? For if we take these two confusions that we see and add them together, then we basically end with a kind of positive idea what gamification could be. Just to make up a term for that, I like to call that motivational design. Say motivational design is a promising proposition. And the leading design question there is, how might you restructure a system in order to support intrinsic enjoyment using game design as a lens that guides you there? Or in simpler terms, if the thing that you were looking at were a game, in what ways would it be broken? In what ways were it poorly designed? And if you find that speaking about structures is a bit waving hands and sounds a bit abstract, what do I mean with that? Well, again, going back to Rev Coaster and other game designers like Dan Cook, and so when they looked across games and said, what's the underlying structure, what's the core element of game beyond which you cannot reduce games? Once you take elements away, it stops being a game structurally. Then you end up with something that is game atoms. They said, this is kind of the core element. If you reduce it any further, it's not a game anymore. They say a game element consists basically out of a certain goal that a user has, combined with a certain set of skills or a certain mental model of a certain system with which he engages in order to reach his goal. A certain set of actions that are spelled out for the user, right? In point-and-click adventures, it's very literally spelled out as a set of verbs and objects for you. And then a certain rule system, the system that you try to understand, which determines whether the action was successful or not. And then you get feedback, immediate feedback and progress feedback on whether you were successful in achieving your goal or not. And out of this connection between goals that I have, a rule system in front of me, feedback that I'm getting, emerges an interesting challenge, right, that I'm trying to solve, that I'm trying to overcome, that gives me an experience of achievement, of mastery, of competence when I mastered that challenge. And once when you use that structural model to look at an activity, then you can also look at the kind of different aspects and ask, well, are the goals spelled out clear and attainable? Are they conflicting or well aligned like good video games? Are the possible actions spelled out clearly or are they diffuse? Do they provide me interesting choices or is it just a road, yes, I will check in? Are the rules transparent and fair? And so on. Once you start to understand something through that lens, then you can ask all the kind of different detailed questions. To make it even more concrete, Khan Academy, in certain aspects, Khan Academy does offer this kind of systemic structure, a kind of actual goal action feedback loop that gives rise to interesting challenges, specifically in the practice section. But here, in this case of video, this is an example of an add-on, right, where you watch a video, and if you watch the video, you get a bit of points for that, right? That's basically our Progress Wars, our World of Warcraft drop or loot. There's no interesting challenge here. There's nothing at which I get better. There's nothing where I can get an experience of, yes, I mastered this. It's just a piece of feedback added to the system. Contrast that with something like Code Academy, and Khan Academy has recently added something very similar, where although it has points and badges for teaching you how to program, the core gaming loop is there precisely in the editor that you see already in the starting page. The thing that Code Academy understood is that coding, programming in and of itself already has structurally a kind of gaming loop in it, in this immediate feedback loop between me wanting to get a certain system to work, putting something in the editor, having it run, and getting the feedback whether it actually works or not. And that is what Code Academy actually does, right? You get the editor, it just says, hey, type in your name and then press enter, and then you immediately get the feedback, and it's either correct or incorrect. And in the course, you are actually learning how to program deeper and deeper and deeper, with the path being structured for you with different kinds of levels in the next goals. So let's do a little reality check. Let's say we try to take these kind of principles, this idea of restructuring something as a game, and say we would want to make something like being a cashier at a supermarket more fun and engaging. What would we do? Well, first off, obviously we would install a feedback system, right? We would give the person feedback on the accuracy of checking stuff out, on the speed, on how friendly you were treating your customers. Maybe we would add some social comparison, how you were, keeping up with your colleagues, and systemic recommendations that would guide you along the way, right? You're a bit slower than your colleagues, here's something you might do. Then obviously we would have a goal-setting system. We would set daily, weekly, monthly goals on maybe accuracy and speed, and you would see your progress towards these goals. And because checking out becomes a rote activity very fast, we would understand that in order to create continued interesting challenges, we would have something like training, job rotation, and job enrichment, slowly expanding the kind of tasks in which you're learning, in which you get goals, and in which you get feedback. And it turns out that these kinds of systems actually already exist, right? This is a Target electronic cashier where every time you check out an item, you get a G or an R, and the G stands for green, which basically says you did it in time. The R stands for red, you didn't do it in time. You get a total score of how many of your things you did in green time and the total number of sales. And I don't know how you feel if you look at this kind of system, but my sense is if I were presented with a system like this, more likely than not, I would rather feel like this guy, like a micromanaged lab rat, rather than this guy, right? Engaged player. So what's the difference? What's the missing element? And that leads me to my fifth thesis. Gamification is thinking inside the box. And that's actually something that's not only true for gamification, but also for serious games in general. Now, what's the first thing that comes to your mind if I say playing a video game? Just think about it. First thing, playing video game. What do you think of? Any suggestion? Controller, okay. What else? Immersive, okay. I'd guess that kind of the first image that comes to mind. Controller is very interesting, but the first image that comes to mind usually is literally a box. It's usually the screen, the interface that you're seeing, right? It's the box. And that includes the controller. It's the game, the designed artifact that you're engaging with, right? Now, are we missing anything in this picture? I'd say we're missing a lot. We're missing everything that is happening around the game. We're basically missing that the people around this game are doing something very specific with this game. Namely, they're playing it. They're engaging with it in a very specific frame of engagement, right? Playing a video game very literally requires both a game and playing it. Or in the words of the immortal Bernie de Koven, even though we are involved in a game, we're not always playing. And even though we are playing, we're not always involved in a game. Playing a game is a special condition of both, right? For we can play with very many things. We can play with our hands, with sticks and stones, with balls, or with cardboard boxes at the office, right? We don't need a game for that. Likewise, we can do a lot of things with video games apart from playing them. We can debug them, we can playtest them, we can present them to other people, we can learn in them, as in the case of serious games, we can engage with them as a form of sports, as in e-learning, or we can actually work in them, as in the case of gold farming, right? And in the course of my PhD research, I actually interviewed a lot of people who were engaging with video games, not only in kind of playing them, but also in kind of these different things, and found that their experience and what they did in the game was actually very different from normally video game play. So what is it? What makes up this frame, this specific mode of engagement with a game that is playing it? Well, let me introduce that with a couple of quotes I culled from the interviews I did. So here's a couple of quotes. "I need to be very routinized. I mustn't let myself drift. I hammer it through. Often you have to force yourself to do it. It's extremely exhausting. It wears you out. My friends usually cannot comprehend how stressful this is." These are obviously video game players who talk about their enjoyment in playing a video game. Namely, it is video game journalists who talk about their experience having to play a game in order to review it for an article. And I find that their statements and their experience is best summed up in this statement of one of them. Sometimes you have to play, you have to get further, and then play is work, right? My article is due tomorrow, and I can't get past this damn puzzle at 10 p.m., and I still have to play through. It's one of the most frustrating experiences I ever had, as one of them told me. So what is missing here, and what makes up this specific mode of engagement, which is play, is simply this, right? It gets us back to Johan Huizinga, one of the earliest people studying play. It is that it is a voluntary activity. Or, in the words of self-determination theory, it is that it is an autonomous activity. It is an activity in which we experience our own agency, autonomy, freedom, voluntariness in engaging with this. And this is actually a very important insight, because usually we believe that video games or play is so fun that people engage with it voluntarily. And therefore the reasoning goes, well, if we only make homework so fun, like a video game, then they will voluntarily do it. But it's actually the opposite. You see, playing a video game, in contrast to homework, is a voluntary activity. I experience my own agency, my own choice, my own freedom in choosing to play this game rather than that, choosing how long I want to play, choosing with whom I want to play it, and therefore it is a fun activity, right? So if you just restructure homework as a game, but it's still mandatory, then very likely it will not give rise to the same kind of fun and engagement. And voluntariness and autonomy is an important, but it's not the only aspect of this specific frame of engagement that is play. The second element that we find that characterizes this specific frame is that play is a safe space. It's a space in which we can fail, a space in which there are radically reduced serious consequences to what we do. Again, in stark contrast to work or to homework. Right? If you look at when animals and kids play, it's if their parents are around monitoring the environment and you know, oh, there's no imminent threat out here and I can just do this and whatever happens, they will watch out for me. It's a safe space. And that again increases your autonomy experience because it means that you're not doing this because of the serious consequences attached to it, but for its own sake. The third element of play is attunement. It is the enjoyment of the shared process of getting yourself onto the same emotional ground. If you look into developmental psychology, you find that the first form of play is actually attunement play between a mother and its child, right? Where the mother picks up the child and the child starts to smile and the mother sees that, reciprocates that smile, and they keep themselves in this kind of emotional loop of mutual attunement in a shared emotional state. In a state in which they watch out for each other and try to keep each other in this positive experience. This is the same thing we find in everyday play, this process of attunement, of caring for each other, right? In everyday play, this is a shocking moment, right? Oh my God! Fully hit in the face. Will he cry? Right? Is this too much? Have I breached play? Is this not play and fun anymore? And then the moment of relief when you say, he's still laughing, it's enjoyable, it's still play, I can continue to soak him, right? If that were not the case, if he were crying, what would people do in order to repair the play situation? Very likely you would come over and say, I didn't mean it. Here, you can have the water gun, please soak me, right? So it's this mutual care about each other's fun and enjoying the situation together. Or in the words of Bernie de Koven, it is the nature of a fun community, of the group of people that comes together to play, to care more about the players, about each other, about having fun and caring for each other and being safe than winning the game, right? That's what we want, that's what we enjoy when we play together. And out of this process of attunement comes a shared focus and attitude, right? That we are focused on the same things and we care about the same things temporarily while we're playing together. Shared focus and attitude on exploring, trying out new, weird, wild things. That's okay, that's actually encouraged while we play. As well as a shared focus and attitude towards mastery, right? If you're playing, you're actually invested in trying to give your best, right? If that boy would just make rote movements to follow along, like saying, yeah, okay, I'll just move that pawn here, right? He would be visibly not focused on trying to master, on trying to play a good game, and then the girl would rightfully say, you're not really playing, let's stop this. This is not play anymore, right? Play is also a situation where benign transgression is welcomed, right? Where it is okay, it's actually interesting to overstep social norms a little, as long as everybody understands we're doing this benignly, while caring for each other. And most importantly, for fun and shared fun, right? Caring about shared fun. As you see in a moment of play like this little prank, right? The moment where the person who is pranked would say, this is not fun anymore, my emotions are actually hurt here, it would stop being play. And the other persons would again try to repair the situation by saying, no, this was actually benign and don't you see the funny aspects of this, right? Which is all basically a long-winded way of saying that a third experience that is created in a play situation is an experience of strong relatedness, of mutual trust, of caring, of attunement, right? A well-played game carries the unique experience of autonomously exercising your competencies, of trying to do a good job, supporting and being supported by others in that process. And the problem is that if you forget about play, if you forget about the importance of the social context and just structure the situation, first off, you run into what has been called the undermining effect, and it's again very well documented across multiple situations that the moment you make an activity mandatory or the moment you add some sort of extrinsic incentive, some sort of extrinsic reward to an activity, that usually undermines people's autonomy experience, right? I get the feeling I'm not doing this because I want to do this, because somebody else wants me to do this. And then I feel controlled and coerced, and then it becomes paradoxically less motivating for me, right? It becomes demotivating. It's the difference between a scorecard in an office being presented as a way of getting to know who is a very smart seller, and then you can just walk over to that person and ask them, well, what are your tricks that I can learn from? Or this being used as a tool of coercive micromanagement, right? That's the difference whether this is motivating or demotivating, whether it is used controlling and coercively or in a way that supports your autonomy. And secondly, if you use these kinds of systems, if you use these extrinsic incentives, you make activities mandatory, if you coerce people, instead of offering situations of autonomy, it actually detrains autonomous regulations. People actually become less prone and less able to self-regulate. The second big danger that you can run into, I find is very well spelled out by what the sociologist Irving Goffman has called the rule of irrelevance. When people play a game, he observed, there is an implicit social norm in place which says you have to focus on the game and basically ignore everything that happens outside of the game. The only thing that is important about a pawn when you're playing chess is where the pawn stands and what that means within the game. It's irrelevant if that pawn is made out of gold or out of wood. The only thing that is important is the game in this situation, right? But if that is the only thing, if you set up a situation as only a structured game without this kind of shared play around it, then you're basically framing the whole situation as strategic instrumental action, as a game in mathematic game theoretical terms. And what then happens is that people basically behave like strategic instrumental actors. They say, okay, if this is a situation where the only point is to reach the goal and you've set out certain KPIs for me to reach here, then that's everything I'm going to care about, right? And that's actually something we have a lot of evidence about in the video game community, in the gameplay community themselves, so much so that we have a term for these people. We call them munchkins, right? To quote Wikipedia, a munchkin seeks within the context of the game to amass the greatest power, score the most kills, and grab the most loot, no matter how deleterious their actions are to the other player's fun. And I'm sure in your personal play histories, you have come across some munchkins who were that focused on winning that they forgot that this was basically about having fun together, right? Or in Bernie DeKoven's terms, they forget that they're part of the fun community that is here to have fun together. They're become myopically focused on min-maxing towards their own goals. And this is something that, again, is pervasive not only in games, but everywhere where you set up these game-like systems without having play around it. As the management consultant James Riley has observed in studying organizations, you find these munchkindoms where wherever people spell out hard goals and hard KPIs, people are very prone to focus on following the procedure and meeting the KPIs rather than asking or questioning what these are actually good for and whether meeting your KPIs actually hurts or helps the company in which you're in. And again, I'm sure you run into these kind of situations yourself. You also find with a lot of gamified applications where people, again, become kind of myopically focused on what they do and ignore the larger question what it is good for or what kind of side effects it might create, right? When BMW tested out this kind of eco-efficiency challenge among their drivers, they found it was very efficient. People used way less fuel, but they also did other things, like not braking at red headlights, because that would basically, you know, be in the way of them min-maxing their own fuel efficiency score. And finally, and again, that's something that we have observed over and over again, it encourages gaming the system, right? That's something we find in the healthcare system, that's something we find in the educational system. If the purpose of the activity is not the enjoyment of mastering it, the enjoyment of doing a good job because you value it, but something outside of that activity, and you set out clear goals and rules and quantitative indicators how to achieve that goal, then gaming the system is logical behavior. It's what the system wants you to do, essentially. Min-maxing your way through. And, well, let me see. So if that is the problem, if the problem is if you set up these kind of game systems without thinking about a playful framing of the situation, then obviously the interesting question as designers becomes, well, can we not only design a system so that it is structurally game-like, but also that it is framed by people in a playful manner? And how can we do that? And how we can do that? Well, for that, I would like to show you a little practical experiment by a couple of colleagues in Amsterdam. How did they manage to do that? How did they manage to get a set of random pedestrians in business suits to start soaking themselves with water guns and say, yeah, this is a good opportunity to have some fun and to play around, right? And I submit if they just had placed the water guns in a crate next to the bridge, nothing would have happened, right? So it's not just, that's the important design inside, right? It's not just the object, the game, or the whatever that you present people. And that's usually what we do as designers. But it's rather what the people around there do with that object, and whether they design that what they want to do with this is play, and whether playing in this situation is allowed and okay or not. So how can you design for the people around that rather than just the object itself? Well, the first design principle is if the core of a play activity is that it is autonomous and voluntary, then obviously you have to support autonomy. You have to make the system optional. I don't know whether you noticed it during the video, but when this girl handed over the water gun to this guy here with the rucksack and the mobile phone, he pushed it down and said, no, I'm busy, I'm on my phone, I have no chance of engaging in this. And then she said, sure, fine, I'm not forcing you into do this. And she put the water gun down and asked the next person whether they wanted to join, right? So support autonomy, give people a choice in what they're doing. The second principle is creating a safe space, right? A space where you feel what I'm doing here in this space has nothing to do with any kind of serious consequences, or whether afterwards I look silly or am looked down upon by other persons or not, right? That's something what good facilitators do during brainstorming sessions, where they say, please no negative feedback while we have ideas, because only then if we ensure that people don't get their egos involved here and feel this is a safe space where you can do whatever you want, there will be no consequence on you, and we won't push you to come up with a good experience, with a good idea afterwards. Only then do people really have the license, the safe space to play around. The third principle is you have to meta-communicate, to signal to other people, this is where play starts. This is now play, this is where play ends. Here's the play space in which we're operating, right? And they did that in a very obvious way, right? They smiled. They said, this is benign. We're not here to harm you. This is a benign situation. So a meta-communication of play is basically a first cooperative move in which you make yourself vulnerable, in which you show that you mean well, that you can be trusted, you mean no harm. You're actually making yourself vulnerable. That's what we see. The parallel to that smile in animal is the play bow, where animals bow down and that way show that they're making themselves vulnerable and that they're interested in playing. The second part of that meta-communication means that you have to get people out of the current frame, their current understanding of the situation, right? You have to show them that there is actually an opportunity to treat the situation that they're in a different way. That's something that the clown army does when it walks in between protesters and policemen and says, this is not just fight or flight, you're not just enemies, actually there is a different way of treating this situation, right? You can change the way that you look at this situation. And thirdly, you can use cues and associations in order to speak to people's memories and make it easier for them to associate what they're doing with a play situation. That's what Lego Serious Play does when it goes into management meetings, and rather than having them do PowerPoint presentations, also say, please build your business problem in Lego pieces, right? People very easily then switch into a different mindset. Fourthly, in order to encourage play, you actually have to model the attitudes and behaviors that you would like to see. Again, you have to make yourself vulnerable. You have to make the first step. That's what these guys did, right? The people who set up the situations, you can recognize them in the videos, are the ones who are actually carrying the shirts here in order to reinforce the two teams, red versus blue. And they were the first to run forward to say, we're doing this, and maybe we get wet first, we make ourselves a bit laughable and ridiculous the first, and you may follow along. Fifthly, and that is something that we actually can design in terms of software systems, you have to offer generative tools or toys, systems that actually have a kind of autonomy, of freedom, an exploration space that you can toy around with, right? This is a very generative, interesting play space to be in. You have a water gun, a lot of people. So interesting questions are, where shall I hide? Whom shall I shoot? Where shall I move to? And if you try to decompose this, what does it mean to be a generative toy or tool? Then I think the best example that you can still run across is Lego. Lego is really the definition of a generative toy. And what makes Lego a generative toy? The first thing is that it is very literally, to use the terms by David Weinberger, small pieces loosely joined. It's a lot of different small pieces that you can easily put together, hand over to somebody else, half done, or take somebody else's and reassemble what he's doing. Small pieces loosely joined. The second principle is, to use the term by Karl Alfrink, a friend designer, of mine, when you want to design for play, you have to underspecify. Instead of prescribing very precisely what the user can and cannot do in your terms, you have to give them an open space which is not perfectly prescribed for them, right? It's the difference between Lego and Fisher-Price toys, where it is very clearly spelled out in Fisher-Price toys. You can push this button, you can turn this wheel, and then after a certain very short amount of time, you notice, well, this is not really playful. There's not a lot of things to explore here, right? The obvious mother lode of small pieces loosely joined and under specification in the gaming space, and there have been a lot of educational applications as well, as obviously Minecraft, right? A full world that is constructed out of these little pseudo Lego pieces, right? But you also find this, that users actually discover these spaces everywhere else, like Farmville, for instance, where people say, oh, obviously, you can even toy around with your little farms and do pixel art, right? Or MySpace, the original MySpace, which was this drastically underspecified space because people could hack their own HTML code into it and thereby design the sites in however they wanted them to look like, right? As a designer, you might say that's ugly, but the people had fun toying around with it. Or actually PowerPoint. I think PowerPoint is one of the examples where people in the office spend endless hours toying around with it because of the joy of exploring the possibilities that the tool offers them. The final principle is that you should provide invitations for people. That is, usually when you run into adults and when you want adults to play, they are frightened by the stage. They're frightened by the blank page. So you have to give them openings, starting points, not finished things, but starting points for play. This play space by the Danish playground designing group Monstrum, I find a very good example, right? It's a playground where you see some crates and a lighthouse and a half-sunken boat with a hole in it, right? It doesn't prescribe what you do, but it gives you an opening, some material where immediately you start to spin your own story in which you can play, right? Why has the ship sunken? Has the lighthouse something to do with it? It's not fully prescribed, but there is an interesting opening for you. So let's reapply these principles in yet another reality check. If we would take these principles for a playful situation and apply them to the situation, what would we do? Well, we would support autonomy, right? We would give the person choice in the kind of goals and strategies that the person would pursue, ensuring that they were concordant with their own personal goals, values, and needs. We would create a safe space, a culture of trust, forgiveness, mutual care, and zero blame, where people are actively encouraged to try out new things in order to reach their goal and in order to master their job. We would have a shared, actual lived attitude around exploration, mastery, benign transgression, and shared joy in the activity. And we would offer generative tools and toys. That is, we would allow people to actively redesign their own space in which they were working. Now let's come and talk a bit about ethics. So I see a lot of potential in using basically motivational design and playful reframing, but still, even in those instances, I think we should be aware of kind of the ethical dimensions of this. And this is what I call out with the seventh thesis: gamification is materializing morality. If you talk to a lot of people about gamification, the first reaction that you get, isn't this evil mind control, right? Aren't you basically trying to trick people into doing something that they don't really want to do and make it appear as if they're even having fun doing it? And that's actually a very common distinction that people like Jane McGonigal and others make. They say, if you use games and game elements in order to get people to do things that you want them to do, then it's kind of evil. And if you use it in order to enable them to do the things they want to do, then it's benign and empowering. In a certain sense, what she's reiterating here is a distinction, a terminological distinction that Michel Foucault has already made back in the 70s, where it's talking on the one side about technologies of power, technologies used by organization, nation states, in order to control and steer and govern people, right? And you can think of gamification examples like lockers, where the whole site is basically set up for you to earn points when you get friends to watch the kind of products that you have on your site and to finally shop from you, and then you can actually redeem the points. So in a sense, the whole system is set up in order to get you to spam your friends in order to shop more. And the converse of that are systems which Foucault called technologies of the self, which is technologies that can be used by individuals in order to empower themselves, in order to lift themselves out of the systems that society has devised for them, right? Things like Buster Benson's Health Month, where you can set yourself health rules every month, and then you get a little email every morning asking you whether you stuck to your rules or not, and then you can get a feedback system on how well you are doing compared to that, and the challenge afterwards is leveled to say, that was a bit too difficult for you, maybe next month try a little easier or a little harder, right? That could be a technology of the self. But I think the kind of teeth here, the one twist that we need to add to Jane McGonigal's distinction, to this simple distinction, is that for Foucault, every technology of the self is at the same time a technology of control. Because in modern liberal democracies, not only are we enabled to be, fully realized individuals who self-determine ourselves and who self-govern and who self-manage and optimize, we are also required to do it, right? These technologies are set up in that way because in a post-industrial economy, you need people who self-manage, self-control, self-organize in order to maximize their own creative output. Which is another way of saying that even in these things like Buster Benson's Health Month, there is a certain, as Richard Buchanan puts it, a certain argument about how we should live our lives, a certain set of norms and values about what is good and proper in a certain society baked into the products. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. I'm just saying this is something we should be aware of when we're building this system. What is the kind of vision of the good life, the kind of idea, the kind of norms and values that we embed in these systems? So even something as innocuous as a leaderboard actually carries these implied norms, like it is good and actually normal and proper to compare yourself, to compete with others, and to be on top, right? That's a value set. And not only do these systems come with implied values and norms, they also come with an implied theory of how social problems, how problems in the education system or in the health system arise, and how to address these problems, right? If you look at most of the gamified applications, the basic idea underlying this is basically extended willpower. They say the problem we have in the education system or the problem we have with obesity and other things is basically that individuals are not able to motivate themselves enough, that individuals are not able to control and self-determine enough. So we're offering these kind of technological tools in order to extend, in order to up their willpower, right? And this is, again, echoing a certain philosophy about social problems and social change and about kind of the diffusion of responsibility in a society that is very prevalent in very many cultures, right? Here's a advertising echoing the exact same sentiment when I landed at Rochester Airport here in the United States. Fisher taught me that anything can be accomplished if one has the desire and determination. Now, is there anything problematic with that model? Well, interestingly enough, Rochester is not the only place where you find this kind of idea. This is a Maoist propaganda poster from the 1970s, and the slogan reads, "When discipline is reinforced, revolution cannot fail." It's the same idea. It's the same idea. The system in which you are living is perfect. If the system fails, it's because you haven't put in enough effort or because some individual messed up. And the problematic bit with that, as the environmental psychologist Jon Turgers in a recent study put, is that this basically puts the whole onus of social problems and social change on the individual. It says if problems arise, it's because of the individual, and therefore we can only solve the problems if the individuals themselves step up. And thereby, he points out, we're actually black boxing, we're steering attention and money and effort away from the larger systemic issues, right? He says, instead of caring about things like everybody driving a bit more fuel efficiently, we're actually black boxing by that the more systemic and the more important issue that we have sprawling city architectures that force people to commute in the first place. Right? Despite of these ethical issues, or I think when addressing these ethical issues, I think that there is still, that's my 8th thesis, something that is worth researching and exploring in gamification. That's basically my little advertising blip, and then we'll move on to the end. So in terms of the little advertising blip, the first thing that is actually interesting is just to get a good overview of this whole system. This is a little book. It's not the actual cover, but we'll come up with something like that I'm editing currently with Stefan Walz from RMIT in Melbourne. That's going to be out with MIT in 2013, where we try to get a look at the different application areas and the different kind of theoretical, psychological approaches to gamification. But the first research topic that I find very interesting in gamification that is worth researching, I think, is this idea of motivational design or motivational affordances. How does game design afford motivation moderated by social context? That term is something that I take basically from Pang Sung, who has coined this idea of motivational affordances, that you can design software systems in order to speak, in order to give rise to people's motivation. The field where I'm currently focusing on is this idea, can we use game design and playful reframing in order to design, not in order to deploy individual serious games in classrooms, but in order to restructure classrooms and curricula as a whole in the image of a game as a playful space, and see how that supports actual learning. That's something that, for instance, Lee Sheldon tries to do with the multiplayer classroom. That's what we ran a workshop on at the Games Learning Society conference, where we're currently just trying to get an idea of all the different teachers who are currently doing precisely this, and just get a sense of the kind of best practices, shared practice, and afterwards see what are kind of the student outcomes there. The second interesting topic for me, and that's a term that I take from Wanda Olikowski, is this idea of frames, right? That there are specific different ways in which we can engage with a system, playfully, gamefully, or otherwise, and how these different modes of engaging with systems shape our experience and our uses of these systems, and how we can actually design for that, right? The playful reframing bit, right? For instance, in the interviews that I did for my PhD research, I found that there was a stark difference between people that were engaging with Foursquare. For some people, engaging with Foursquare was playing. For other people, it was using. And the experiences they had with Foursquare and the kinds of ways that they were using Foursquare was very different to playing on whether they framed this as a play activity or as a usage, as a utility activity. Right? Similarly, we can ask, okay, if we know that these contextual factors, also flowing from self-determination theory, are important for the experience, also the motivational experience of people, then what we can ask, well, what is the effect of a leaderboard being framed in an office space as controlling or informational, as this is used by a manager in order to micromanage you, versus this gives you information whom in your workspace to ask, right? Or one actual research project that I'm right now involved, again with people from RMIT Melbourne, is where they're trying to put these little exertion games, exercise games, into actually public trams in Melbourne. So the idea of this game is that you see a little projection here of these rafts flowing in water, and when there is the raft, you can stand there, and the moment the raft disappears, you have to pull yourself up until a raft appears again. And the moment they told me about this project, I said, not only do you have certain safety issues here, but also you just have social framing issues, because this is not a space where play among adults is expected and perceived as appropriate. So what kind of design cues can we place here? What are the kind of existing social norms and frames in a public tram, and what kind of design cues might we use so that people perceive play, just in the case of the water bridge, as something that is appropriate, that is good, that is okay in this space? And the third and final topic I'm interested in is rule design studies, right? We have a lot of different disciplines that look at how to use rules and how to do things with rules, to use this wonderful term by Twinning and Means, which is an introductory textbook to law, right? And if you look across disciplines, you find that computer science, economics, game studies, law, all of these different disciplines from different perspectives look at the actual design of rule systems in society, from a legal perspective, from an economic, in terms of incentive systems perspective. But there is not really a discipline that asks, if we set up a new law for registering CO2 emissions and how that is actually put into place, or craft a code and conduct and regulation mechanism in a company, how do we design that, and how do we study the effects and the design of that holistically from all kinds of perspectives and with a designerly approach? And I think that is something, again, that we can learn from kind of game studies and gamification. So having talked that much about gamification, I'd like to close with my final thesis, which is gamification is a terrible word to use. And I'd like to stop using the word afterwards. It's a terrible word to use because, first off, as Ian Bogost so elegantly put it, gamification is bullshit. Which is, of course, a technical term. It's a philosophical technical term coined by Harry G. Frankfurt, where he said bullshit is a statement made by a person who doesn't care about whether the statement is true or not, who only cares about furthering his or her own purposes by making that statement. That's exactly the point that Ian Bogost makes. Gamification, the way the word has been coined and the way that the term has been constructed is precisely there, first of to appeal to games and their cultural momentum and their cool and their fun, and then at that ification or ifi at the end, to make it appear as if this would be an easy add-on process. So that's the first thing, right? The term itself, gives rise to associations which are essentially bullshitty. The second issue is that, right, if you look at things like game atoms, the thing beyond which you cannot reduce something, beyond which it stops being a game, or in kind of all the classic definitions of what is a game in game studies, you find that most definitions have multiple necessary components. So then the question becomes, well, what is a game element precisely? And if you look at the kind of different elements in gamification that have been called out, right, rules, goals, quantitative feedback, or rewards or something, you find that there are either things that are not game specific, right? Goals and the psychology of goal setting is pervasive. You find that everywhere apart from games. Or there are things like redeemable rewards or analytics that don't have anything to do with games per se. So you end up with an empty Venn diagram, right? And thirdly, obviously the talk about elements encourages this kind of add-on thinking, as if you can take certain elements and just place them somewhere else. So what to do instead? Well, to go back to the beginning, if you remember the kind of HCI studies and user experience studies that have looked into what is playfulness, what gives rise to the experience of something being playful, then you could say, there's actually, so if there's playfulness, right, if you think about ludus and paideia, if there is this paidic experience, then you can talk about the complement. You can talk about something like gamefulness, having the experience or giving rise to the experience that a game gives rise to, right? That's a term that I and colleagues take again from Jay McGonigal, gamefulness. So whereas playfulness is about giving rise to experience of paideia, playful, toyful, with gamefulness you ask, well, can we give something the experiential qualities of a game? And then what you do basically is say, no, we're not longer talking about elements, but we're talking about affordances for a certain mode of engagement with something or a certain quality of experience. That we're no longer talking about gamification, but something like gameful design. So these were my 9.5 thesis. It's nothing new. It's the use of game design elements in non-game context, and then I sack that definition. It's an inadvertent con because it tricks people into believing that there would be an easy way of doing this, but there's actually something worth salvageable, which is trying to understand systems and looking at systems as a whole as games and asking how can we restructure them. But if we only look at the structure, then we're thinking inside the box. Then we're not thinking about play as a specific context or frame of engagement in which people engage with games as system, which is just as important and something that we can design for. There are important ethical components in gamification that we have to think about. It's definitely something, in my opinion, that is worth researching, and it's a term that we should stop using. Now you may ask yourself, what's the 0.5? Well, I already alluded a couple of times of it. My 0.5 thesis is that you all should go and read The Well-Played Game by Bernie de Koven. It's a book that was coined as part of the new games movement back in the 1970s, where people were thinking about, can we design games which are challenging and really appeal to your mastery, but are not competitive, right? And that is the point where Bernie de Koven wrote this book, The Well-Played Game. It will be soon reissued by MIT Press, and it's the best phenomenology still of play experiences and how play and games are different sets of experience. And it's from Bernie that I will take my final note. Inscribed in gold in our flag is the motto, if you can play it, change it, and woven into our banner, other words, if it helps, cheat. Thank you. So now let's see whether the technology works. And we get audio. Yes. Are we hearing audio? Can somebody online ask a question?
Let me see.
Okay. Up until then, we'll start with questions here. Yes, please.
As a system designer, how do you go about assessing the different design interventions that you might do? Like traditionally, you will do control experiments and so on.
Yeah.
But is playfulness and gamefulness the appropriate match to these kind of control design experiments, or do you think of different methodologies when assessing these kind of design interventions?
Okay. So assessment is an interesting question in terms of whether you do it in a formative phase or afterwards in a kind of, so is it user research or is it usability testing essentially? Generally, what I prefer in the formative phase is actually, as any good designer and game designer would do, is to go to a very rapid prototyping process, where it's very much about building something that is a system and that can be experienced as a system as quickly as possible. And paper prototypes or role-playing it is perfectly fine. Bringing in individuals, and then you have basically in the kind of game user research field a couple of developed, be it easy questionnaires or so that you can use to gauge things like enjoyment or so. Or in self-determination theory, you have a very good developed model, the player experience of need satisfaction, or PENS model, which basically gives you an easy way to assess, okay, how much does a person experience autonomy here? How much do they experience competence? How much do they experience relatedness? So you can use these kinds of basically questionnaires. But what you would usually do, especially in a formative space, is just do play testing and do very detailed debriefing interviews or just loud thinking by people to get an insight more into where the design itself is working or not. But once you have this kind of game atom as a model and you then zoom into kind of the different aspects of that, you can have all kinds of design principles for what makes good goals or what makes good feedback that you could use if you look into an existing system essentially as a set of heuristics. And without user testing, look at it and say, well, I don't get any progress feedback in this system, right? You set a goal that is far out, but I have no sense where I'm standing in relation to that goal. So you can basically use, I'd say, all the various methods or kind of forms of assessment you would use in traditional user experience design. You would only use slightly different metrics that would come rather out of kind of the game user experience field. And then if you want to get full out, then basically you here in Microsoft with the game research lab, the kind of in parallel capturing video game play plus having people kind of report their enjoyment in parallel is obviously kind of the gold standard. But usually if you're just designing systems, you don't need to be instrumented that big. Yeah. Uh-huh.
So the whole in the classroom environment and the redesigning the classroom to be able to use your concepts. And when you have that autonomy situation, that is a fundamental. Right? It's how do you? Can you give me an example of where you were of a classroom setting where you're teaching math or whatever, you were able to provide autonomy, make it, redesign it with gamefulness in that kind of a classroom situation.
So two practical examples. The first is basically connecting to the interests and goals and needs of the students, which is what good teachers do anyhow. That is that they come up with real world problems that come out of the life world of the students and really, not just, kind of token come out of their life world, but something that really catches their interest and therefore suddenly they are interested in figuring this out. And then you say, well, if you learn this mathematical concept, you will actually be able to build this thing that you want to build. So that's kind of the first very obvious kind of way, finding real ways in which to connect to the goals and interests and values of people, because then they feel I'm doing this because I want to achieve my goals, and then it's an autonomous experience. The second thing is basically what's the amount of meaningful choice that you can create in a system which is not overwhelming for systems. What the teachers usually do is what basically Montessori schools do, is that you don't have one kind of curriculum that you force everyone to, but that you say, well, I predefine a set of tasks, of challenges as kind of self-contained things that I place in the classroom or that I place in binders. And the kids themselves, when they come into the classroom, have a choice of what thing they want to work on. They know that they have to work on something, but they have a choice in what they want to work on, depending on where their current interest or their current needs are, and you are then more the tutor. And connected to that, you would then offer the kids also kind of clear progress feedback in terms of, instead of a degrading grade, you would say, well, you all started at an F. And with every activity you do, you see how that activity slowly builds up onto your actual grade. And you don't have to do these required activities, but you can do kind of any combinations of the activity that I offer you. As long as you get the final point score, you will get an A for that. And again, that supports my feeling of actually having choice in the matter, which actually leads to the fact that certain students find, there's this simple activity that I can do over and over and again and generate points for that. And I actually had a math teacher saying, that's actually beautiful. That's wonderful. They believe they game the system and they trick me, but actually they get very good practice in this kind of basic mathematics activity that I want them to have a lot of practice in. So they feel autonomous because they believe they tricked me, but actually they learned what they should learn. And after having that experience that they can find ways to trick the class system, then they're in a state, in a mindset in which it is way easier to engage them in the other activities as well. Especially if they then find, but if I then do this activity, that's actually much more fun and enjoyable and gives much more point than when I do this rote activity over and over again. Yeah. Other questions? Did we actually get questions from?
No.
Okay.
We lost a lot of people went over to ResNet.
Okay.
Yeah, I have one.
Should go. Wow. Okay,
Yeah.
so I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on things like games with a purpose, or things that, like, games that are trying to make things that are obviously, well, I don't know obviously, but that they're traditionally considered really boring and really, you know, like not a very small amount of intrinsic motivation.
Yeah.
Just what are your opinions on whether that works or not, and what are the ethics of these?
Well, the ethics of it, they have so ethics first. That's a lot of dimensions. So you have to ask for, obviously, what are your intentions as a designer? What are the actual effects that you're having with this? To what extent is this transparent to the user? To what extent do they have a choice in the matter of opting in or out? To what extent are the kind of values and goals that system that you set up proposing, right? So is this about, I don't know, engaging people in a mass hacking exercise, or is this another activity that you're engaging them in? So these are all kinds of ethical questions that you have to think through when you look at the actual kind of system. Secondly, in terms of my thoughts of that, the genius of Louis von Ahn is not only coming up with the idea of games with a purpose, but coming up with games that are actually fun doing them. That's the game design genius that sits in things like the mind reading game, like the ESP game, right? Where it's about tagging images, but actually the way that he sets up, it's about mind reading. And mind reading, if you think about poker and other games, is really a core challenge that we enjoy in all kinds of social games immensely, thinking about what the other person could think about. So I'd say they work. They require a lot of design work and thinking, and you might not necessarily always come up with solutions that are as fun and engaging. Secondly, it also comes down a lot to the framing. So is this framed to me first and foremost as a game that I play, or as a rote activity that I engage in? If you look at the individual numbers, at the performance numbers that his original ESP game got, and the Google image label, which is precisely that thing, just bought and reissued by Google, you find obviously that thing has way more scale because it's exposed to more people. But if you look at the individual's people engagement metrics, you find that they're way less engaged in the image labeler than in the ESP game, because that is framed as a game that I play and not as, can you tag some images for us, please? Yeah. Okay, you have a question? Okay. And here was a question somewhere. Yes.
A question about Montessori.
Yeah.
And what grade? It feels like they go through middle school and then
I mean, at what grade Montessori schools start
Yeah.
usually as a system?
Isn't it middle school usually, or?
I don't.
I've never heard of a Montessori method used beyond
Yeah.
that, yeah, probably 8th grade or
Yeah.
7th or 8th grade. And it's just interesting to think about that would be a great challenge to try to employ that method in a high school situation.
Well, if you read, say, Kurt Squire from University of Madison, Wisconsin, he also, in his design, in the kind of more engaged role-playing games that they did with people way older, a lot of his design thinking also comes from the fact that he was a Montessori teacher and tried to apply this. And secondly, the classrooms that we looked at with these teachers were actually classrooms. So this went up to undergrad Latin education. People using the same kind of principles for that. So it seems to work as a design principle even in that age range. And if you look at things like, say, Code Academy or so, what they also do well is that they give you a choice where in the kind of level system of road up to very challenging programming tasks you want to engage in. You can start really high. You don't have to grind your way through. If you find that that's the bit that you find more interesting, or you believe that is catered to your current level of competency. Yeah, and that's targeted at adults, essentially.
Do you find that is it acceptable for people to come to a gaming situation for different reasons? So if you imagine playing chess in the park,
Yeah.
you might have one player that's focused on mastery, like they
Yeah.
spend a lot of time at it and they want to get good at it.
Yeah.
And then you have a new player where, you know, they're not trying to master it, they're just sort of having an exploratory afternoon, if you will.
Yeah.
Do you find that that's compatible, or do you think that's best if people are coming to a gaming situation for the same reason, like they're both coming to it for fun, or they're both coming to it for mastery?
The good thing there is that with the, you pointed out a social situation in where there's people from radically different backgrounds may come together for a play situation. Is exactly chess in the park. You usually find people playing games, you find that they do it with friends and family, very usually, or just people they know, this kind of strangers coming together. You find that in those situations, or online games, essentially. And that's a bit I didn't get into here, but if you look into developmental psychology, you find that the early forms of play, pretend play, playing together with other kids, are essentially the learning grounds for social emotional skills. Playing with other people, that process of attunement, of caring for each other, of recognizing what is going on, what is the goal of the other person, what is my goal here, is he having fun, am I having fun, how can we come to a shared ground where both of us find something that we have fun together in doing so. That is the skill that you learn. That is one of the core social emotional skills that you learn in playing. So I would say in those situations, it's an actual negotiation process between the people where they exercise these kinds of skills to find a shared ground together, where they say this works for both of us. Like two people playing ping pong, and the one is radically better. And then you say, okay, can I create a constraint by which I play ping pong just with one hand or behind so that it continues being interesting and fun for both of us. And that's an actual skill that is exercised and trained in these kind of situations. It is more difficult if people come from different backgrounds. Yeah, but it's also a learning opportunity for precisely dealing with that.
It's interesting you mentioned negotiation, because obviously if I think that I'm a skilled player, using a ping pong example,
Yeah.
my opponent tries to play with his hand behind his back,
Yeah.
I may not take that in the right way. That might be like not
Yeah.
a safe environment for me, because I don't feel like you're basically communicating to me in a hostile way that I'm not a challenge to you.
Exactly. That's the communicative or meta-communicative skills. I'm not doing this in order to put you down, but I'm doing this with a benign intent in order for both of us to enjoy the situation. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.